Slavoj Žižek. Enjoy your symptom. 3. Why is every act a repetition? 3.1 Beyond Distributive Justice. Why was Chandler's Playback a failure? The obvious failure of Raymond Chandler's last novel, Playback, 1958, is usually explained by the decline of his creative impetus, which is then tracked down to his alcoholism, born of despair after his wife's death. Yet the function of this escape into psychology is, as always, to allow us to elude the inherent logic of the failure. In order to detect it, one has to bear in mind that Playback grew out of a screenplay written in 1947 and 48, which, due to a series of unfortunate circumstances, was never shot. Here is Chandler's initial treatment for the screenplay. The crucial week in the life of a girl who decides to spend it in a tower suite in a hotel under an assumed name, her identity thoroughly concealed with great care, to accept what comes, and at the end of the week to jump to her death. During this week, the frustrations and tragedies of her life are repeated in capsule form, so that it almost appears that she brought her destiny with her, and that wherever she went, the same sort of thing would happen to her. What we have here is the skeleton of an entire ethical narrative. At the beginning, there is a forced choice which marks the subject's existence with guilt, the traumatic death of the girl's husband, and Playback. This traumatic situation is then repeated, replayed, opening up to the subject the possibility to redeem himself, herself, by means of a suicidal act. The crucial change brought about by novelization was of course the introduction of the first-person narrative. The story is now told as it is seen through the eyes of Philip Marlowe, and thus changed into a normal, hard-boiled detective novel. Therein consists the ultimate reason of its failure. It endeavors to incorporate into the hard-boiled universe a subjective position, an ethical attitude, which is formally excluded from it, i.e., the presence of which renders visible the falsity of the very perspective from which the story is being told. To put it briefly, the subjective position of Marlowe, a cynical romantic sticking to his values against the wicked world whose corruption is embodied in the femme fatale, is founded upon the misrecognition of the ethical attitude embodied in the girl's suicidal act, which is why the interest of Playback, the novel, consists in its very failure, as the confrontation of two incompatible logics. Incompatible since one of them implies the repression of the other, it reveals the inherent limitation of the hard-boiled universe. We encounter the same ethical narrative of the act qua suicidal repetition of a forced choice in William Siron's Sophie's Choice. The traumatic original situation takes place in a German concentration camp where a Nazi officer confronts Sophie with an impossible choice. She has to choose one of her two children to survive, while the other will be sent to a gas chamber. If she refuses to make the choice, both of them will die. Driven into a corner, Sophie chooses the younger son, thus contracting a burden of guilt which drives her into madness. At the end of the novel, she exculpates herself by means of a suicidal gesture, torn between her two loves, a psychotic failed artist to whom she is indebted for saving her life after her arrival in America, and a young beginning writer. She chooses the first, and together they commit suicide, although Sophie's Choice functions today as a true cosm evoked in numerous ethical treatises. One should note how, as a rule, attention is focused on the original situation of forced choice and on its disturbing ethical implications. How should one perform in such a situation? Is not the proper attitude to refuse the choice as such, whatever the costs? Whereas the problem of repetition, i.e., of the suicidal act by means of which the subject can later exculpate himself, is singularly absent from the debate.